All right. 1 Timothy chapter 4. We've come to this passage in 1 Timothy where Paul is telling Timothy the things that he can do to be a good minister. We've come to this part where he's telling Timothy ways to practice, things to do in his preaching so that he can properly fulfill the calling in which he's been called to. So let's just go ahead and pick up in 1 Timothy chapter 4. Let's pick up in verse number 12, and we'll read down through the end of the passage. Let no man despise thy youth, but be thou an example of the believers in word and conversation and charity, in spirit and faith and purity. Till I come, give attendance to reading, to exhortation, and to doctrine. Neglect not the gift that is in thee, which was given thee by prophecy, with the laying on of the hands of the presbytery. Meditate upon these things, give thyself wholly to them, that thy profiting may appear to all. Take heed unto thyself, and unto the doctrine. Continue in them, for in doing this thou shalt both save thyself and them that hear thee. Let's go to the Lord in prayer. Our Heavenly Father, Lord, as we come before you this afternoon, we pray that you'd help us as we preach and teach through this passage. Lord, help us as we desire to bring you, Lord, all the glory and praise. Lord, help us to speak and speak clearly. Lord, I pray that you would go with us each as we finish up the services this week. Be with the many needs that are listed, and Lord, the things that aren't talked and spoke about. Lord, I pray that you'd guide each one of us and be with us till we come again on Wednesday. In Jesus' name, amen. We get to this juncture again. We didn't read verse 11, but verse 11 really connects verse 6 through 10 on when it says, these things command and teach. It's just kind of a summary to close out or a conclusion to verses 6 through 10. So we come to a new passage, a new section. Before, in verses 6 through 10, you know, and if you think about chapter 4, what all has been said so far in chapter 4, we've got what to do with apostasy, hypocrisy, and false teachers. Then we have a section on the duties of a good minister. And then it goes one step farther from verses 12 through the end of the passage, and it's going to speak on counsel, Paul giving counsel to a young minister. What he's to do. The first thing it says is, let no man despise thy youth. Now, I in one of the commentaries, one of the ones that I use the most, one of the homiletics, which are messages, if you don't know, but one of the messages that was in that commentary that was written said that Timothy and Paul would have been together at about the time, through history, supposedly, at about the time that Timothy turned 25 years old. And they say about 10 or so years has passed, which puts it right in line with what I believe at the time, that Timothy was really the age of a lot of us, around 35 years old. But at the time, Timothy was teaching a much more mature church. Yes, I know you all aren't very mature. I was really hoping to get a laugh out of some of you that way, but come on now. Anyway, but culturally, right? The younger were not to take any sort of preeminence over the older. In matter of fact, if you consider this, the first 4 verses are counsel to youth. If you go to chapter 5 for just a second with me, It starts out, rebuke not an elder, but entreat him as a father, and the younger men as brethren, the older women and as mothers, and younger as sisters with all purity. Honor the widows that are widows indeed. Right? So in chapter 5, it goes from counsels to a young minister to what a young minister should do and how he should treat the flock, the respect that comes within that. So I think Paul is guiding Timothy on how to act, because culturally, 35 was very young and had, at that time, didn't have a whole lot of business standing and teaching before people that were much older. You know, to this day, you'll still find men that don't believe that young men in their 20s can pastor, can do anything within the Lord's church because they need more time to be seasoned. I don't personally think that. Now, the Lord didn't allow me to pastor a church until I was over 30 years old. Spent 8 years studying the ministry or learning in the ministry. So I don't necessarily think that age is a problem, but what we find in this passage is the maturity or the maybe the ability of how a young person carries themselves matters. And so in verse 12, it says, let no man despise thy youth. Well, why would somebody despise your youth? Now, all of us are, for the most part, are young and youthful, except for Brother Brian. And so we have to think about how we carry ourselves, right? How we carry ourselves with great maturity. Right? How do we? Now, we might say, and I say this seriously, do we carry ourselves with great maturity? If this was a passage written to us, would we give people an excuse to despise our youthfulness? And that just simply means, well, they're so young and immature, they don't know what to do. Pastoring a church to where you have to exhort and teach and train in doctrine is not the place for someone that is immature. They don't belong in the pulpit. And I think that in a lot of ways, Timothy is being reminded of that. The way you act matters. What you do, it matters. How you carry yourself, that matters. Right? Let no man despise thy youth. But, again, we see the changing of that narrative. But be thou an example. What kind of an example? Of the believers. Let no man despise thy youth, but be an example of the believers. So Timothy, the youngest, or at this point, one of the younger men of the church, was to be an example to the others. So it kind of gets down to what's our excuse? What's our excuse for not being a good example? What's our excuse for not living as we should? We all, I've heard this so much in my life as a Christian. I've heard so much, don't give people, let no man despise thy youth. All of us should be trying to understand it, and we certainly should be explaining it to our children. It makes me think of Proverbs 22, verse 1. A good name is rather to be chosen than great riches, and loving favor rather than silver and gold. A good name, you only get one of them. That's it. And if you act foolish or you act a fool, that's what your name is going to be. We should not give anybody an example to despise our name. What do we say when our children... I'm going to pick on my own son, mostly because all of you men saw him dig himself in a hole about 15 to 20 minutes ago. Leo had Brother Tyler's talking about his brand new toolbox. And I was like, yeah, he was saying, I didn't realize how many tools I had until I filled my toolbox up. And I said, I'm right there with you. I'm still working. My toolbox is as big as this This is not even as big as this pulpit. And I've taken things, but my tools end up all over. And I said, yeah, Remy knows how to put my tools away. And my youthful oldest son goes, yeah, I just string them all over the garage and let them be where they are. And as I try to correct him, of course, the youthfulness in him, I begin to despise for a minute because of the comment that he followed it up with. So to my son and to all of you, my son gets preached at from the pulpit today, and then he'll get preached at home too. Why do you want to give somebody an excuse to think less of you than you really are? And we can pick on a 9-year-old, but let's pick on a couple of 30-something-year-olds and 40-something-year-olds, right? Why do we want to give people an excuse to despise us? Despise could simply mean have some disdain for us or to want to step away from us. You know, if we have that father and son conversation at home, later it might go something like, why do you want people to think differently of you? Why would you want to say that? And I think Timothy is getting a lot of cause for hold back. Don't, be careful. And then on the parent side, we go, you're making me look ridiculous, right? I bet none of you have ever had your kid disrespect you openly in front of people and make you look ridiculous. I never did it as a kid, except I did it many times, and I once did it in front of my pastor and got corrected by my pastor. It's hard when pastor and dad gets to correct both ways. But I remember getting corrected by Pastor Titus. But why do we want to do that? Why don't we want to live to a standard of being able to be a good minister? Now, a child makes silly, disrespectful comments like my lovely son did. But how often do we in our 30s find ourselves doing the same thing? Right? I mean, how often do we say something that we ought not say? Let's just say this. What if we go, this hasn't happened either, but what if we go to a restaurant and we have terrible service? See, some of you are starting to laugh now. What if it's awful? Takes 2.5 hours, you sit there and the food doesn't come. Aren't we supposed to still be an example of the believers? Now, I don't think anybody gets as grumpy as me when they're hungry. Some of us. But I mean, in all reality, what silliness that we participate in, right? So you think about the command that Timothy is being given, and then you even think about wrapping Proverbs 22:1 into that. You know, we get all over our children for the way that they act and make us look ridiculous when we do that just fine all on our own. Timothy is being given a hard line and some very strict guidance. Let no man despise thy youth. Don't give anyone a reason or an example of your behavior of you not following the Lord. Timothy, here's how you're going to pastor people that are older. You need to lead them, number one. You need to not give an example for them to look down upon you and think that you're like a 9-year-old boy that makes a comment because of immaturity. Timothy, you're going to be on the straight and narrow. You must. You know what this comes down to? You know what I think the number one thing that we could talk about in this passage is our mouth, our tongue. We need to learn to just be quiet. I'll tell you what, one of the best things for me every week now is getting in the car, driving 1,000 to 1,200 miles a week in 2 or 3 days, and being quiet. Enjoy the silence. It'll teach you to not open your mouth. And I say that in the most respectful manner. If we could learn as young people to not open our mouth, to understand that it does not have to move all the time, we wouldn't let people despise our youth. Typically, what makes us look foolish and immature is the flapping of our gums. We have 2 eyes, 2 ears, and 1 mouth. Use that in order. I was talking to the girls in Sunday school this morning, and we were just talking about how I was explaining to them about learning some things. And I looked at both Madison and Peyton, and I said, you both, I watch you. I said, you both may sit there, but you're listening, and you're learning, and you're observing. And it's the same thing to all of us. We need to do more listening, learning, and observing than talking and speaking on things that we ought not speak about. It's hard. As pastor, sometimes I just want to walk by and just go, shh, just stop. Not because I want to be disrespectful, not because I want to be mean. I just want to protect you. Be quiet. You know, when I first started out in sales, I would not be quiet. And I had a boss, my boss there, if this was my desk, his was right here. And he had his back to me because they didn't trust me. And they shouldn't have. I was 21 years old. And he would sit up there, and all of a sudden I'd hear him make some, at first it kind of took me off guard, like, why is this guy talking when I'm trying to talk? And he's trying to get me to be quiet. And then he'd walk by and embarrass me and go, try to get me to be quiet. And if I look back on one of the reasons why I sold cars when I did, is because the Lord has used that to teach me control and to listen. Because I was not one that listened. I was one that talked. And so using that, even going back to this verse, when I started at Terry Hendricks back in 2015, I was 21 years old. The man in the front office had been selling cars for 44 years, I think. The one next to him, 20. The one next to him, 20. They were all at retirement age. And here I am, 20 years old, intimidated. The whole clientele of the store was all older people. And I remembered, I remember thinking about this verse, let no man despise thy youth, how I had to be careful, right? And it's funny how you'll find things in life that connect with the teachings that you've received in the presence of one of the Lord's true churches. But how often do we let people despise us? Think differently of us? We ought not be a people that folks walk away from and they say, how incredibly immature is that person? We ought to be a people that they say, oh, they're a Christian. Listen, the best way to not let anybody despise you is to just simply be quiet. Use your God-given talents in order. That means listen, look, and think before you speak. Speaking is a privilege. You ever think about that? Speaking is a privilege. What do I mean by that? Let's use some common examples. For those of you adults, did any of you speak at your high school graduation? Okay. Did any of you ever volunteer, get called on to speak at some big formal award? Right? Very few of you. Here's the other part of that. How many of you volunteered to speak? You think about these things. Speaking is a privilege. Being called upon is a privilege. Timothy got to preach the gospel, got to pastor the church. And I think that Timothy's desire was to serve the Lord, and that's why he was willing to take these instructions. Letting no man despise you is hard. This church is very young. If you average out this church, the church is young. There's a lot of people that despise the church because of the age, the inexperience, the history, the past, whatever, on and on we can go, right? Be an example of the believers. That word "of" is critically important. Let no man despise thy youth, but be thou, you individually, each one of you out there in the church, you need to be an example on your own. Model it at home, model it in public, model it in your bedroom, in private, in the vehicle. Be an example. An example of what? Of the believers. Take inventory. Are you an example of the believers? When you speak, when your mouth opens, is it like a run-on sentence that doesn't make you an example of anything? Or do the words you speak edify Christ? Not letting anyone despise your youth also means this: that you don't put yourself on a pedestal to try to take the place that you don't put yourself to the place you're trying to get to. If that makes sense. You don't place yourself up on the pedestal as the leader. I've seen many young people. I've seen young preachers from the time that I'm talking from the time that I was a young kid. I've seen young preachers come onto the scene from a young kid. And unfortunately, when you live in a house where, for a while we lived with my grandma and grandpa. When mom and dad moved from Ohio, we lived at the parsonage there at the church in Wauseon with my grandma and grandpa. And so you get the conversation of a young preacher who was my dad. My dad surrendered to the ministry when I was a year old. And my grandfather. So you get my grandfather taking my dad and saying the not-to-dos of all of these things in the people that he's seen, and the must-dos. And for the first 10 years of my life, I remember my grandfather having conversations with my dad. What to do and what not to do. And you see the same common and critical missteps that young preachers take. All the time, it's the same thing. And a lot of times, they try to elevate themselves to a position of leadership and authority. That's not being an example of the believers. That's allowing somebody to despise your youth. We as young people, especially, we must model humility. We must model humility. We must model thankfulness for the ones that we can learn from. Don't let anyone have an occasion to condemn your actions. And you ought to pray for me that I may keep myself from this, but also that I would have the boldness to come up to you out of love and say, quit talking. Just stop. Not because I want to make you look bad, but because I want to keep you from making yourself look bad. Haven't we all been there? You think about those times where you said something you know you shouldn't have said. You just kept running on and running on and running on. Oh, we need it. I need it. Timothy, being an example of believers, he must avoid the possibility of being justly criticized, where they could bring something up and talk about something that he truly did wrong, taking away from his example. So are you an example to the believers? Well, how? What kind of example are we? Well, we're an example of the believers in word. If we look here in verse 12, let no man despise thy youth, Timothy, but be thou an example of the believers. Timothy, be an example of the believers in word. This refers actually to Timothy's conversation, just like we've been talking about. This word is not translated as in the Bible, but the words that he speaks. This refers to his speech, and our speech, Timothy's speech and our speech, should be a speech that should always be characterized as a child of God speaking, not a child of the devil speaking, not a child of ignorance speaking. Not only should he avoid that, but avoid speech that does not edify or strengthen the ones in which you're speaking to. Understanding the context. Timothy was given a ministry. Now, what if I sat up here and acted like a 10-year-old as I preached? Now, some of us do that from time to time. We like to joke a little bit, right? But in all seriousness, all jokes aside, would you really respect the words that are being spoken? Would you respect if I, as pastor, came to you and corrected you for something and told you you're doing something that I do every day? Would you have a love and a respect when I say, don't do these things, enough to say, I understand. Pastor must have really seen something that I need to change. Timothy, be an example in word, in conversation. Well, again, you might be thinking, well, you just talked about words. Conversation is his actions. It's translated out as his actions. Nothing in Timothy's demeanor, the way he carried or conducted himself, should give somebody just cause to say, look what you did. That ought to scare you. Here's things God's people could benefit from: being quiet, being slow. I'm talking about the slow where you're slow to wrath. You're slow to act. My dad used to tell me that him and I had the same problem. We were knee-jerk reactions. I always said it was more so him, and I probably was that way too. I just, as a kid, I would always point and say, it's always you. But I learned from him with a knee-jerk reaction to something. Got to go handle this situation right now. Let me tell you something. That's the flesh. That's typically the flesh. Somebody does something to your kids, your family, your job, this or that. Oh, I mean, it's just your world's coming apart and you must go handle it. Otherwise, it's a slap in the face to your family. It's a slap towards your own manliness, if we just want to be very blunt, right? But that's not being an example. God's people would benefit from acting like Timothy and being slow to react. Here should be a rule. If your kids are disobeying and you're tired of it, you need to go put yourself in timeout before you put them in timeout. Why don't you go pray before you go act the fool? We've all done that, right? You pick up your kid, you're so mad at them. You pick up your kid and the legs swing out like that because you've got so much emphasis on taking them and you're angry. You're wrong. That's part of your conversation. That's part of what we're saying here. People see that. You're out in public, your kids are embarrassing you, or they're not acting, they're not doing that, or they're not listening. Hey, remember everybody, they're children. You didn't get them figured out by the time they were 2 or 3, or 9 or 10 or 17 or 18. You actually have to work on them. You have to do the training, which means you need to slow down. You need to control yourself. You need to model what Christ would be like. That's what we need to do. But we don't want to from time to time because it's just kind of inconvenient to what we want. I told the girls in Sunday school this morning, we're spending time in the book of Ruth. And I was talking to both girls this morning about the relationship side of what had happened. And we read through Ezra and read through Nehemiah, where, in Deuteronomy chapter 7, in the Mosaic Law, it never really says that, in Deuteronomy, it never says that they were not to go marry the Moabites. But when it's in the past, in Ezra and in Nehemiah, it talks about how the Israelites had taken the Moabites in for their sons to marry, or their daughters, giving their daughters to the Moabites, or taking of daughters of the Moabites. And how they were, I believe Ezra or Nehemiah specifically talked about the need to turn away from that. And when I was talking to the girls about the relationship side in life and about being unequally yoked and what happens when you're not unequally yoked. Well, in the case of Naomi and Elimelech taking their boys to the green pastures up on the table of Moab, that it looked good from there. And in verse 19 and 20, Naomi talks about she went out full and came back empty. Well, she went out full of pride and they left to go to the land that they wanted to go to, that they could see, that looked good, just like this world looks good, and she came back with nothing because they didn't teach their kids those things. And I even told them, I said, you're at the most carefree part of your life right now. I said, the hardest thing you have to do is obey your parents. I said, once you go out and the Lord blesses you and you become married and you start having a family, you don't get any breaks. And that's something that we have to get right and through our heads right now. I have to. You and I don't get any breaks from our children. Do you have to step away from time to time? Yes, that's not what I mean. It's when we intentionally don't want to do the job that the Lord has given us. And that comes down to our conversation. You probably think, I think you're all wrong and you've gone off the rails, and so I'm trying to correct you. That's not at all. I want you to look at Timothy as being an example. How not to let people despise his youth? Be an example in word and in conversation. Where is all of your conversation at today? It's in the children that you're raising. It's the way that you handle yourself in the raising of your children. It's the love that you show, the love that you model, the things that you do, your willingness to do what needs to be done. You are all a living example. And honestly, you need to grade yourself. Because you're either doing a good job or a bad job. And let me tell you, just when you think you're doing a good job, it's coming. Man, and it hurts. You come back from Moab empty. And you realize what you could be and should be doing. Your conversation is going to be a lot in how you carry yourselves. We pick. This is something I think that's commonly said. And I believe all of us in this church, the Lord has blessed us with unity on this subject. None of us really like to just give our children tablets and phones and let them distract themselves. None of us really have any desire to do that. I think we all see the harm and the dangers in that. Now, we go out and we go out in public, and you just see as parents are sitting there eating, mom and dad are on their phone. Kids take their iPads into the restaurants. I mean, families can't even sit down and eat. And we look down and we say, what's wrong with them? But you know what? As soon as our kids do something that we don't like, we completely fly off the handle, and we're no different. Come on, grade yourself. Think about those times. Think about those times in which you've been embarrassed. Your pride was hurt because half of you did something that you don't like. You still have to be an example. And then you go too far the other way, where you want to get into the thought of, well, let's just gentle parent, right? And believe me, my wife and I went there. My oldest son, when he was 2-3 years old, was the strongest-willed kid I had ever met. And my wife and I thought we knew how to parent before we had kids. We were the best parents there was. And the Lord gave us Leo to humble us. And that's usually how it works, just so you know. You're the best parents until you have children. That's usually how it works. And then your children manifest all the things that you said they would never do right before your eyes. And you go, oh no. Right? But you can go too far the other way, where you let your kids walk all over you and you don't demand a kind respect, and you're still not having a conversation. So if you're to be an example, you ought to be right down the middle. If your kids are old enough to get you to the point where they can disrespect you openly, and I fear that, especially in the world in which we live in, we let our kids openly disrespect us way too long. Kids, if you're here, you only know when you disrespect your parents. And parents, here's the thing. There's a twofold problem there. You're letting them disrespect you, and you disrespect your own parents. That's where they're learning it from. You don't think it's going to be a problem later? We think it's cute when they come up with little disrespectful tones when they're 2, 3, 4, 5 years old. Trust me, it's not cute. Have some sort of a standard. Be a model in that conversation that you're not going to be mean to them, but you're certainly not going to let them just sit there and openly disrespect you. You should respect your own parents. Your children should respect you. Timothy had to have the respect of the people, which meant in chapter 5, he had to give respect. Do you see where we see this application coming in? Timothy says, or Paul says, let no man despise thy youth, but be thou an example of the believers in word, in conversation, in charity. I'll tell you what, you can know a lot about a person and their spiritual state whether or not they have charity. If you're a person that is saved and you're so thankful for it, you're going to give a lot of grace. You're going to correct with grace. You're going to correct with love. You're going to live with love. You're going to model love. But that's where I get down to the point where I've preached so often, you can't fake it until you make it. One thing you can't fake is having true love of Christ. There's that charity that cannot be manifested. That is what always comes out. For Timothy to properly minister to people, he had to love them. When I got here 2 years ago, I looked out, and you were all older than me. Something happened. You stayed the same age, and so did I. You're still all older than me, with an exception of a few of you. How in the world was I to be able to pastor, rebuke, exhort, teach people that were older and sometimes more mature than me? Sometimes. And sometimes I'm very less mature than you all. How was I to do that? With love. Listen, if I came in 2 years ago, you all helped me move, I said, okay, see ya. I'll see you on Sunday. And I showed in and I had messages for all of you. I mean, I knew what I needed to do to fix every single one of you. And that's what every message was. And you came up to me after the message and said, brother, that was tough, but I needed it. And I said, yes, you did. That's why I preached it, because you're wrong. It's not really showing a lot of love, is it? It's not demonstrating love. But the Lord taught me that I needed to have enough love. That number one, I knew that I'm just a man. And the Lord, I believe, has allowed me and my family, my wife and I specifically, to have such difficulties over the last 2 years to stay reverent to the things that you all go through as well. Because what you don't understand is ministry is very separate. In some ways, it's very protected. The Lord takes care of His ministers. But there is times, I see Sister Sandra shaking her head. She remembers this. There's times where you step out and you lose touch with the reality. Loving people, respecting and loving people will give you a blessed ministry. Now, love is a demonstrating love. Timothy was to demonstrate love. This is going to sound terrible, but you will agree with me. We all have a lot of things that we want to do. Sometimes, those things that we want to do is not to go to each other's house. I mean, when I met Brother Brian, he said, I want to be invited, but I don't want to go. And I never forgot that. I thought, what is wrong with this guy? First, I was like, what's wrong with all these people? They drive an hour to church. You know, I jokingly say that. And then Brother Brian sits there in that chair at Brother Derek's house and I want to be invited. I just don't want to go. I thought right then, boy, these people need to be loved and told they need to go. But it's true. We all have our own wants, our own desires, the things that we want. And love is not necessarily what always enters into our mind for each other. It's lovers of our own selves, lovers of our own desires. So we see all these things out of Timothy so far of just ways that Timothy needed to be an example. ways that Timothy needed to teach. Pastors that come into a pulpit and have the motive that they're going to change everybody and fix the ministry, they don't stay pastors at that church for very long. By God's grace, I am what I am. And there's a lot of other places I could be. But by God's grace, He called me. He counted me faithful, placing me in the ministry. The least I can do is love a bunch of people with the same flesh that I have. And love them enough that when I see them not going down the old path anymore, to run after them and try to turn them around. That's hard to do sometimes. Pretty much all the time, that's hard to do. Slow down. Model appropriate reactions. Be quiet. If you go back a couple of verses in 1 Timothy, in verse 8, for bodily exercise profiteth little, but godliness is profitable unto all things. Do you know what one of the strongest muscles in your whole body is? The jaw and the tongue. Because we use them all the time. So don't exercise that part of your body. Practice godliness. Speak things that edify the Lord only. It'll change your life. And if we teach our children that, it'll change theirs too. Love is a hard thing. People perverted the word love and they make it out to be this crazy, wonderful feeling. That's infatuation or lust, typically. But love is a demonstration of an action. Let no man despise thy youth, but be thou an example of the believers in word, in conversation, in charity, and in spirit. Again, spirit reads differently. It reads a little bit differently. Timothy was to preach and to be an example and enthusiasm for how the Spirit works. When we're scared, do we depend on the Holy Spirit to care for us? When we lose a job or lose a loved one or have something break on the car or something detrimental happens, do we depend on demonstrating the love through the Spirit and the joy in the Spirit? Timothy has so many ways. Next one we get to is in faith. Timothy was to demonstrate faithfulness, steadfastness. Do you know what steadfastness is? If you go right back in chapter 1 and verse number 3, it says, and as I besought thee to abide still at Ephesus. Timothy in chapter 1 was commanded to stay in Ephesus. Why? To minister to the people, to preach to them. That meant that he was going to undergo much difficulty. We cannot say that me as pastor and you as members, we have not undergone much difficulty. The Lord has blessed abundantly. But what happens when we undergo much difficulty? What happens when we lose toe of the reality and what we're to do, and we begin to undergo much difficulty? Or maybe we do nothing at all and we're persecuted from the outside. We must abide still and be steadfast. This comes back to Timothy, you're going to be instant in season and out of season. Continue to reprove, rebuke, and exhort with all long suffering. Steadfastness, faith, be faithful to the teaching, faithful to the office. Timothy, be dependable. It's hard to say that you're going to depend on a man. You don't depend on a man. You depend on the office as pastor, the divine office as pastor. Timothy, you have to be dependable for the people to depend on the office that you do. I will tell you from experience, thinking about how people need me to be dependable scares me to death. I had this conversation with Brian's brother yesterday, talking about the grace that God is giving me. And what I was saying to him was, grace and God alone are the ones that are going to sustain. Dependability is not coming from me. Dependability is coming from the Lord. My responsibility in that is to look to the Lord. Look to Him for grace, for mercy, for guidance. Look to Him in faith that He will take care of me. You need to look the same way at the Lord for dependence, for grace, that He will take care of you. How to be a good church member, how to follow the Lord faithfully, look to Him always. I even went as far with the girls in Sunday school this morning, and I said, listen, the conversation is twofold. Let's say you become entangled with somebody outside of the world or in the world, and you become unequally yoked. Are you going to remember this conversation that we had about Naomi and Elimelech and what happened to the entire family? And I said, or let's say you have children and you just allow them to have relationships with whoever they want. Are you going to remember this conversation? Sometimes remembering will keep us faithful. Remembering where we came from will keep us faithful. Last one. Let no man despise thy youth, but be thou an example of the believers in word and conversation, in charity and spirit, in faith and in purity. This is all about motives. What we're talking about is the man in the pulpit. Not me, but the office of a pastor in a pulpit. Here's what a pastor can't fake. Number one, his motives. Brother Daniel was telling me, when he went to camp, there was a lot of younger men in their late teens that were saying the Lord had called them to the ministry. And he said it happens all the time, brother. He said, as you sit and talk to them, what they want is the honor of the ministry. They don't want the work of the ministry. They're not really called to the ministry. They think they want to be honored by being in the pulpit. And he goes, we don't want those brethren to come through and even begin teaching them until they're truly, duly called. And he goes, and many of them never, ever will be truly called. The motive in purity, this characterization of the motive is, why is someone in the pulpit? Did they desire the position? I fear a lot of that's going on in our day. Or were they harnessed and called and had to go without doubting like Peter did? If the Lord ever calls you to the ministry, the conversation is often given run. The advice from older preachers is run. And they say that, and it's a terrible way to say it, But the truth of the matter is, if the Lord is calling you to the ministry, you want to be sure about that calling. There's people that haven't been sure, that felt like they're called, and they don't last very long. It's a calling that takes grace, takes faith. And the only way you get grace in the calling is if it's truly the fact that you're called. Why do I say that? We're not going to get to it today, but in verse 14, when it says, neglect not the gift that is in thee, which was given thee by prophecy, with the laying on of hands of the presbytery, the gift that was in Timothy in verse 14 was the presence of the Holy Spirit. That was the true gift. So this purity, sometimes the best way you can earn respect is by loving people with a pure and true heart. Being a pastor is not standing up and saying, you're wrong, you're wrong, you're wrong, you're wrong, do this, do this, do this, so I can sit back and laugh at you. People might think that sometimes. Pastoring the people is not standing up here and preaching. I think I am probably, out of all the men that have recently taken a pulpit position, I probably preach the fewest. I'm very confident I preach the fewest out of all of them. And that's because learning to pastor a church doesn't happen by standing up here and reading through the words that the Lord is going to provide anyway. Sure, you're going to learn some things of not to do and to do, and I have a lot more to learn. But pastoring is done by sitting in the pulpit or sitting in the church pews and watching your pastor pastor. It's the part that happens as soon as I say, and that's all I have for today. And as people come around and they have their comments, as you call throughout the week, as you need help or need advice, that's the pastoring part. That's the part that you have to do everything you do out of love and respect. Not, oh, I don't like you, so I'm going to say this. You all are crazy if you ever think I do anything because I don't like you. My love is deep for everyone. And because my love is deep, I cannot ignore the burdens the Lord gives me from time to time. When I see you doing something that my natural reaction is just to let you be. That's my flesh. Maybe I'm lazy in that. Maybe it's just the fact that I don't really like confrontation, which manifests itself in the way that when I have to be confrontational, I don't beat around the bush, I just say it so we can be done with it. But that purity means that you can't doubt the fact that I as pastor, love you and respect you. And I shouldn't be able to doubt that you love me and respect me. I shouldn't be able to doubt that you're not faking it. Make your calling of election sure. I wrote this note for myself, and I told you a lot of times in my notes I write things for me. And I feel that we're far enough into our ministry here, and we're close enough to all of you that in my brain that apparently doesn't work like everybody's, you know, a lot of you can at least pick up kind of what I'm thinking. I wrote in my notes, no one should ever enter the church building with the thought process of, boy, I've really got something to teach today. You don't want that. You don't want that heart. There's no love in that. There's no purity. Purity is a beautiful thing in the ministry. Timothy is being told as a young man. You think about how hard it is And we can all look back enough and see the mistakes of things that we've done. We can see the disrespect, the disobedience, the foolishness, even down to maybe times we entered the Lord's house in a manner that we shouldn't have, the times that we've acted a way in the Lord's house that we shouldn't have. We remember those things. Timothy, at that young age, I mean, consider where Timothy's at. For the majority of us, we're all on the age of what Timothy was, leading a mature church that he's already had the correct doctrine in. Think about it. No, I was trying to see how much time I have, but I'm way expired. We'll pick up in verse 13 next week. As you go home, you need to think about these things. Don't ever use the excuse, well, I'm not going to be a minister. I'm not going to be a preacher's wife. You don't know what you're going to be. Or you don't know what effect you're going to have on someone. As you go home today, within the next week, I want you to slow down, speak less, and quit being afraid of the silence. There is beauty in the silence. Do you know what that's called? Meditation. Verse 15, meditate upon these things. When you're not speaking audibly to somebody else, you can meditate on the things in which you've been taught. And in the meditation comes learning and life application. Meditate on these things. We'll close services for this week. This goes to